There is a moment you already know if you've dealt with a narcissist. You say something reasonable, their face changes, not into anger, into something colder, calculation, and within 5 seconds you're the villain of a story you didn't know you were in. The Stoics had an answer for this, not a comeback, not a trick, a rule. One that makes a narcissist's entire strategy collapse, because their power was never really about them. It was about something you were handing them, every time, without knowing it. By the end of this video, you won't hand it over again.
There is a moment you already know if you've dealt with a narcissist. You say something reasonable, their face changes, not into anger, into something colder, calculation, and within 5 seconds, you're the villain of a story you didn't know you were in. The Stoics had an answer for this, not a comeback, not a trick, a rule, one that makes a narcissist's entire strategy collapse, because their power was never really about them. It was about something you were handing them, every time, without knowing it. By the end of this video, you won't hand it over again. They didn't have the word narcissism. It's a modern category, but it's drawn directly from their teaching on assent, on what Epictetus called the gap between an impression and your agreement to it. The rule is this: you do not owe your assent to someone else's reality. Say that slower. You do not owe your assent to someone else's reality. A narcissist doesn't just say things, they construct realities. Small ones in almost every conversation where they're blameless, you're unreasonable, and the facts from an hour ago have quietly rearranged themselves. Their power exists in the exact moment you accept that construction as real and start explaining yourself inside the frame they built. Epictetus called the raw sensation of an event the fantasia, the impression. Between the impression and your response lies a gap, and inside that gap is the whole of human freedom. What a narcissist is engineering in almost every exchange is the collapse of that gap. They want the impression and your reaction happen so fast you never noticed you had a choice. Marcus Aurelius described a place inside himself no external chaos could reach. Later readers called it the inner citadel. He put it simply: nowhere can a man find a quieter retreat than in his own soul. Not stone walls, walls made of judgment, and nothing gets past them without your permission. That's the second half of the rule. The citadel exists, and you're the only one who holds the key. But this only means something once you see it played out in real time, so let's make it concrete. You raise a legitimate concern, calmly. Instead of addressing it, they flip it. Suddenly, you're too sensitive, too dramatic, making everything about yourself. Psychology has a name for this: Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim and defender. But the Stoics would have simply called it an attempt to seize your assent by force of speed and confusion. Your instinct is to defend, to re-explain, to produce evidence. And here's the trap almost nobody sees until it's too late. The moment you start defending yourself inside their frame, you've already lost. You've accepted, functionally, that their version of reality is up for negotiation. You're now playing a game they wrote the rules for, on a board they control, for a prize you never should have wagered. The Stoic rule says something different. I do not enter the frame. I look at what's been presented, this invented reality where I'm suddenly the villain, and I withhold assent, calmly, without announcing it. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius that the wise man is beyond the reach of injury, not because nothing is thrown at him, but because nothing thrown lands where it can wound what's essentially him. Protected the way a rock is protected from the sea, not because the waves stop, but because the rock was never going to be moved by water in the first place. This is not coldness, and I want to be clear about that. You're allowed to feel the sting. Epictetus never asked anyone to stop feeling, only to stop being ruled by the feeling before reason gets a chance to look at it. there's a gap. Live inside it. That's where your entire freedom exists. Here's why this rule is more devastating to a narcissist than any argument could ever be. Psychology calls it narcissistic supply, the attention or reaction a narcissist needs to sustain their sense of self. The Stoics diagnosed the same mechanism 2,000 years earlier with different words. Anger is fuel. Tears are fuel. Frantic self-justification is fuel. Even hatred is fuel, because it's still proof they control your inner state. The only thing that actually starves the mechanism is genuine indifference. Not performed, not the silent treatment, which is just another reaction dressed up as a weapon. Real indifference, from someone who has simply moved their center of gravity somewhere the narcissist can't reach. This is what the Stoics called apatheia, badly mistranslated over centuries as apathy, as if it meant not caring. It meant almost the opposite. Freedom from the kind of externally triggered passion that makes you a puppet on someone else's strings. A person in apatheia isn't numb. They're more present because their attention is no longer hijacked. They watch the manipulation happen the way you'd watch a magician's trick once you already know where the card is. There's nothing left to be fooled by. And a magician whose trick has been seen has no trick left at all. There's a story, likely more legend than strict history, but instructive anyway. Stoic teachers would have one student hurl real personal abuse at another, while the student being trained practiced doing nothing but noticing. Noticing the impulse to flare up, the heat rising in the chest, the mind already drafting a comeback. And then letting it pass, the way you'd watch a storm cross a valley from high ground. This wasn't a parlor trick. It was athletic training for the soul. Epictetus called it ascesis, the same word for the daily discipline of philosophy, because no one becomes unshakable by reading about it. You become unshakable the way you get strong, through repeated practice under real strain. So how does this actually work tomorrow in a real conversation? 3 steps. First, notice the frame. The instant someone starts reconstructing events to quietly make you the problem, name it to yourself. This is a frame.
Second, decline entry. You don't have to announce it. You can say almost nothing or something brief and ungraspable. I see it differently, and I'm not going to argue about it right now. Notice what that sentence doesn't do. It doesn't defend. It doesn't explain. It doesn't offer evidence to a jury that was never going to rule fairly. It states that you haven't accepted their reality, and it ends there. Third, return to the citadel. Whatever happens next, they escalate, they mock your calm, they accuse you of avoiding the issue, which is often exactly what happens because your refusal to supply a reaction is itself intolerable to them. You return your attention to what's actually yours, your judgment, your next action, your peace. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that could have been written for this exact moment. The best revenge is to not be like your enemy. Not because forgiveness is soft, but because becoming reactive means adopting their currency. You've let them define what winning looks like. Notice this isn't the same as set a boundary, even though it can look similar from the outside. A boundary is still a negotiation. It says, if you do this, I'll do that, which means you're still bargaining inside their frame, still hoping they'll respect the terms. Withholding assent isn't a negotiation at all. It doesn't require them to agree to anything, change anything, or even notice what you're doing. It only requires you to stop supplying the one thing they actually need from you. Here's the part most advice about narcissists gets wrong. This rule isn't a strategy for changing them. It won't fix them. It was never designed to do so.
Marcus Aurelius didn't write his meditations hoping to reform the corrupt senators around him. He wrote it to make sure their corruption couldn't corrupt him back. That's the entire aim. Not offense, not even defense in the way we usually mean it. Closer to structural immunity, the condition of someone whose sense of self doesn't depend on winning a narrative war another person is desperate to start. And here's the strange result people who've actually lived this report again and again. The less you supply, the less interesting you become as a target. Not because you won some confrontation, but because a narcissist's attention, like fire, moves toward whatever still burns. Someone who has genuinely stopped burning is eventually simply left alone. It won't happen fast, and I won't pretend it does. The first few times it will feel wrong. Every social instinct will scream that silence is agreement, that not defending yourself means letting them win. That's exactly the discomfort Epictetus predicted, because the part of you invested in being seen as right doesn't surrender its abits easily. But notice what you're actually protecting when you feel that urge. Not truth. Truth doesn't need your defense, it simply is what it is. You're protecting your reputation in someone else's mind, a thing Epictetus placed firmly in the category of things not up to you. Chasing it is chasing smoke. Let's go back to where we started. That conversation twisting beneath your feet, you apologizing for something you didn't do. What actually happened is that your assent was taken before you noticed it was being asked for. This rule exists to close that gap, to slow it down just enough that you get to choose every time whether to enter their constructed reality or stay inside your own, calm, sovereign, untouched. If this gave you language for something you've lived but never named, send it to someone still explaining themselves inside a frame that was never fair to begin with. And the next time you feel that old pull to defend, to explain, to win, pause and ask the only question that's ever really mattered. Is this mine to control? If it isn't, let it stand outside the gate. The citadel was always yours. It still is.